Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Impact Mobility webinar. My name is Luke James. I'm one of the directors and head of content at Impact, and I'll be your moderator today. First of all, thank you very much for joining us for what should be an informative and lively discussion on the topic of public and private partnerships and how we establish the business models for mobility as a service. I will introduce you to today's expert speakers in just a few moments' time, but it isn't just on them to do all the heavy lifting today. We want your questions. This is your opportunity to ask them directly at any point during the webinar. Send the questions in. I will then put the best of these forward, and we'll ask them during the Q&A at the end. And before we kick off, just a quick reminder: the webinar is produced in the run-up to our Impact Mobility Conference, which is taking place in Amsterdam this June on 24th and 25th. We are a business intelligence company first and foremost. So I guess based on extensive research, we looked and thought there's a need here for a conference where we have all the key mobility stakeholders together under one roof as we look at partnerships and execution plans for mobility. So we've put together 50 plus European cities, in addition to policy experts, the likes of POLIS and EMTA, who we'll hear from shortly, alongside automakers, mobility service providers, and data analytics companies. Our mission is to connect public and private organisations to discuss and shape opportunities driving urban mobility. And much of what our speakers discuss today will be centrefold in June. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speakers. We have four great experts for you. We're going to kick off with a presentation with Suzanne Hoadley at POLIS, who will sort of look at the public sector perspective, look at the high-level opportunities and challenges across Europe as cities look to integrate with new mobility models. Thomas at EMTA will then pick up the baton and focus on the transit authority side and how they are being increasingly innovative in their approaches. Krista at MaaS Global will, I've written here, discuss MaaS, which is sort of in the title, isn't it? The roadmap and strategies as we work with cities and how we create a shared mobility solutions, convenience, affordable, and comfort for private ownership. Finally, last but not least, Chris at ViaVan will be looking at the shift towards on-demand and how this has created a shared window for private partners to help cities reduce car dependency and to support emission targets, in particular looking at their Transport for London pilot. So before we open the floor to discussions and take your questions, I want to hand over to Suzanne. So Suzanne, I'm going to give you the wheels of the car and let you start us off.
Thank you, Luke. Right, can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Okay. So thank you. So good afternoon from a very wet Brussels. So as Luke mentioned, as he said, I will be giving you a snapshot of how cities are experiencing new mobility modes and models. So where they see opportunity, where there is some disbenefit, and how they are responding to this. For those that don't know POLIS, we are a network of city and regional authorities promoting innovation in transport for sustainable mobility. And we're based in Brussels. We have about 70 city and regions that are members of our network across Europe and also beyond. We have a couple of members outside Europe. So first, before I actually get into the subject matter, I think it's good to remind ourselves of what the main mobility challenges in cities are. We know that new mobility services and models are a very topical discussion item in transport circles, but I wouldn't say these are the core issues in cities. The main issues in cities, I've put a selection of them on this slide. So it's really about poor air quality, You're probably aware that many cities are implementing low emission zones and introducing other types of measures to address this. A second issue is congestion. It doesn't seem to be getting that much better, but the nature or the cause of that congestion is starting to change. I mean, some cities like Brussels, Barcelona and Dublin, they're saying that congestion is increasingly being caused by commuting traffic, so people coming from outside the city, because people living in the city are using their car less. You know, it's so difficult to use a car in a city. It's so difficult to find a parking space, but we you know, a big cause of traffic is the commuters. And a third big challenge in cities is road safety. Although the road safety picture has improved a lot over the last 10 years in Europe, that's not necessarily the case for vulnerable road users, so pedestrians and cyclists. And this is very concerning for cities because they are, you know, they do have big policies to promote walking and cycling. They're investing in the infrastructure and the like. So it's very, you know, this is a bit of a worry. Why is this relevant to new modes, new business models? And that is because, you know, cities, they will be expecting these new modes, these new business models to help them address some of these challenges, or at least not to undermine the efforts that they're implementing to address some of these challenges. So moving, I'll just close this. Moving on to, so what are some of the opportunities that these new modes, whether it's e-scooters, free-floating bikes, on-demand transport, car sharing, what are some of the potential opportunities of these new modes? Well, the first one is really this promise of getting drivers out of the car and using new mobility services, so delivering on this goal of modal shift. A second potential benefit is improving the efficiency of existing transport services and public resources. So if we can replace some traditional public transport services that are underutilized, very expensive, if we can replace that by other types of modes, on-demand modes or car sharing, then that could potentially lead to an economic gain. In a third opportunity relates to sort of inclusion and outreach, and that's really about enhancing access to transport services, so providing transport to parts of the city that were difficult to provide traditional public transport in the past because of the low and dispersed demand. And then of course we know that these new types of services are offering more choice to users, so they're very customer centric. But in addition to the opportunities, or on the flip side of the coin, there are also some downsides to these new modes, and the first one relates to the use of space. I think we've all seen pictures of some e-scooters or free-floating bikes that have been littering the pavements. I've got some pictures on this screen that I took with my own camera on my various travels around Europe. A second disbenefit is safety. You know, we hear of collisions and in some cases fatalities between these new modes and other types of road users, especially vulnerable road users like pedestrians. Now, of course, there are unfortunately injuries, collisions, fatalities all the time. But still, I mean, this is something we need to address. And I think in the US, I included a screenshot of a billboard from the US, where we see some lawyers actually trying to make a business out of accidents involving e-scooters. A third area, which is a bit of a worry, is the impact of new services on congestion and modal shift. And some of the figures we are seeing from the US and some of the headlines as well are indicating that we could be seeing a rise in congestion, especially from the TNCs, the transportation network companies. And I've also included on this slide some figures from a study that was undertaken in Manhattan on transportation network companies again, so the Ubers and the Lyfts of this world, which show that there has been an increase in total mileage. So it's gone up by 50% between 2013 and 2017. And also there's been a doubling of unoccupied vehicle hours. for taxis and TNCs between 2013 and 2017. So this doesn't really make for very pleasant reading, at least from a city perspective. And the final downside relates to access and equity. And again, we have some more figures from the US, which show that it tends to be the younger, the better educated and the more wealthy people that use these types of services. So how are cities responding to some of these new modes? Well, firstly, in relation to e-scooters, I think on the whole, cities, at least European cities, they first adopted a wait and see approach to try and understand well what the effects could be. And now we see that more and more cities are starting to adopt new rules related to the deployment of these services. So on this slide, you can see some screenshots taken from presentations and other information material related to some of the measures that Paris and Madrid are implementing. So I've broadly categorized some of these rules into three main areas. So the first relates to regulating the size and distribution of these services. So for instance, capping the number of vehicles by city or also by neighborhood within a city, levying a charge per vehicle. So this is something that Paris has adopted quite recently, and also requiring the sharing of trip data. This of course is needed to be able to properly manage and regulate these services. A second important area is safety. So for instance, restricting the use of the scooters to specific areas. So that might be to roads or to bike lanes. And also we, in some countries, they are requiring the insurance or the wearing of a helmet or a minimum age limit. And a final area relates to minimizing the nuisance to other street users, so requiring parking in designated areas. This is the case for Paris. I was in London a few weeks ago, and I also saw that there was some e-scooter parking areas as well. And Paris, interestingly, will be fining users for misuse. So if e-scooters are left in a place when they're not supposed to be, and if that user is caught, then they could potentially be fined for that. With regard to on-demand transport services, again, we're seeing different approaches emerge across Europe. So for instance, in Stuttgart, we have public-private cooperation. So the public transport operator SSB is cooperating with Movil to deliver, I think it's called FlexBus. I don't exactly remember the name. In London, they're funding the pilot of an on-demand transport service in the London Borough of Sutton. This is a borough where there is high car dependency. So this service is essentially intended to feed the high capacity transport network. And the final one, I came across this article just the other day, and I haven't had the time to look into it yet, but I thought it was quite interesting. It concerns a small Canadian town of maybe 25,000, I think, and this town decided not to offer a traditional scheduled bus service, but to ask a TNC to provide the transportation service. And the service has actually been so popular, and it's now costing a lot more than the town council had originally envisaged, that they're having to look to contain the popularity of this service. So for instance, to reduce the subsidy or to cap the number of trips that a citizen can make with this service. So I think this example, of course, the citizens of this town are not happy if there's a cap or if they have to pay more for the service. But I think this points to the need for really, if you decide on this particular option, to really think carefully about how you design that service and to try and anticipate how demand will change over time. So key questions for cities and regions in Europe, particularly for our members going forward, really are: how can cities plan for new types of mobility services and business models? Which policies they should adopt to get positive outcomes and also to minimize a disbenefit, and really what role should they be playing in this new mobility paradigm. So what are the most appropriate governance models and where is regulation needed? And for this, I think we really need more evidence about the impacts of microtransit, micromobility, and also MaaS apps in terms of travel behavior, trip choice, vehicle kilometers traveled by car, and also safety and equity. And my final slide, POLIS is involved in a new European research and innovation project called GECO. It started in December, and it's really looking at governance and regulation in an era of mobility disruptions, and we are creating a stakeholder group. So if you're interested in engaging with the partners and with like-minded people across Europe and indeed beyond, then please do get in touch with me. So thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Suzanne. We're now going to move on quite quickly on to Thomas at EMTA, and coming from a more European transit authority perspective. So Thomas, I think you're now online. Can we hear you?
I hope so. Hello, good afternoon.
We can. Hello, Thomas.
Let's just see that presentation is there as well, I guess. Good afternoon, everyone. From a not wet but very, very grey Amsterdam. I'm going to be talking about the EMTA, or rather the Transport Authority perspective, which is quite contributing to what Suzanne said before, as we're obviously doing our services for the cities we're operating in and for. But first, about myself, my name is Thomas Geyer. I'm a transport engineer, and I work for the Vervoerregio Amsterdam Regional Transport Authority, and I'm seconded to EMTA, the European Metropolitan Transport Authorities, for about the half of my time. And well, what is EMTA? It's an association of the transport authorities of larger European metropolitan areas. We bring together twice a year the high-level executives of these authorities to discuss issues and topics they see themselves confronted with in their work. And we also bring together really kind of workflow experts from our authorities to have very in-depth discussions and elaboration on specific topics. And we're currently running such a collaboration effort on mobility as a service. And I'd like to give some sort of insight into the work we've been doing there. So if we look at MaaS, then we kind of need to consider that that term has been used for quite a lot of things, and it's been quite difficult to find a proper definition for it. Whereas we really saw the need for a definition, because there's a lot of ambiguity in the field. So also people in public office actually asking us whether MaaS could not be solutions for issues where it is obviously not a solution for. So we needed to get clear about that. So from the EMTA perspective, if we look at MaaS, then what is it? Well, it's a mobility solution which is based on the integration of services that are already there. So public and commercial services. We have a service provider and that uses a digital interface to allow planning, reservation, support and payment, and also the alteration of the whole trip. And what it is as well from the public authority perspective is it is a tool that generates and provides authorities with insights about travelers' needs and travel behavior in our cities, which actually allows us to more targeted provide investments into public transport and infrastructure. So that is a really important part for us. What it is not, so just to be clear about that, it is not a container term that can be used for any servitization in mobility. And it is definitely not a transport service in itself because it does not produce transport capacity. And that is a very important one where it gets often mixed up. So MaaS is not a solution for transport poverty or transport deprivation. It simply just connects services that are already there. And how is MaaS set up then? Well, if we look at these three pictures here, then we see users, the current setup of transportation, pretty much of our transport system. We see users that consume transport products, and these transport products use use infrastructure, and each of these transport producers actually has a known value chain with its customers. And what mobility as a service does in the end is it kind of inserts two new roles between those two levels, which is a systems integration role and a service provision role. Going on, what we see from the public perspective, if we talk about MaaS and the setup of this whole ecosystem, then we see us confronted with kind of four major issues, which we need to take into account when we set up mobility as a service ecosystems in our areas, together with the market, and that is conditions of monopoly. We need to talk about redistribution of public space for commercial purposes, as commercial service providers will require space in our city to provide their services. We need to talk about data asymmetries, and we need to talk about the issue that services apparently only pop up in areas where public transport is the most profitable. So we're getting actually a lot of competition in areas where we don't want it, and in areas where we need new services, we don't really get solutions offered there. So these are the issues we have in our back mind when we talk about mobility as a service. Coming back to this ecosystem, if we look at this ecosystem now, then what does this mean to each of these roles? How do we need to design these? Well, first of all, from the authority perspective, concerning users, we consider that these positive effects MaaS can bring can only materialize if we're attracting a very wide public of users to use such flexible and journey-based mode choice that MaaS promises. So in the long term, the goal would definitely be to facilitate multi-modal travel for any kind of travel motive and any customer segment. So it doesn't matter if that is business travelers or students or commuters or families or tourists. They should all have somewhat the possibility to consume mobility or to source their mobility through multi-modal applications. So in order to make that possible, we actually recognize, or authorities recognize, that a one-size-fits-all solution might not be the proper approach for that, although that might be the so far preferred model of public transport authorities. But we rather need a variety of services with that can differentiate their offers to different target clients. And to reach such a variety, it's necessary to generally enable any organization that has a good business plan to provide a MaaS service, whether that is a public transport authority or operator, whether that is providers of shared mobility or taxi-like services, or whether that is any external organization like a startup MaaS operator, or even a company that induces large volumes of traffic. You could here think of a sports arena or a fairground organization. So they should be all able to provide multimodal services to their clients. And we actually also envision not only large and skilled and capital-rich organizations to be able to do such services, but also enable smaller initiatives and startups to be able to step into that market, so to reduce entry barriers. And to reduce entry barriers, we will need to have a somewhat open and facilitating market approach. And there we're talking about the data and systems integration, which we kind of see that there is a need for a publicly steered, somewhat digital infrastructure that unites all service relevant data and systems from all transport providers and makes these in an integrated fashion available to MaaS companies, non-discriminatory, fair, and generally openly accessible. So the system will then need to become a sort of trusted clearance institution for multimodal transactions. So it needs to ensure good conduct of all ecosystem parties and make sure that rules set by the transport providers regarding the representation and use of their services, etc., is valued and taken care of by MaaS operators and their clients. As this system would be set up as a sort of public infrastructure, cities and authorities will definitely have access to data and insights that are relevant for regulating the system itself. Suzanne had already talked about the need get data and insights in order to actually be able to regulate the system in the public value perspective. So to regulate the system itself, but also to be able to anticipate where future investments in infrastructure are most useful, and the value of these investments can be enhanced. So this data we kind of envision that would be available to public authorities would be time and location of journeys, the chosen modes, and the interchanges at a somewhat aggregated level to be able to see the trip streams. In the end, such a public infrastructure approach would enable each organization in the ecosystem to actually take its part in the MaaS system without having to make large investments or make themselves dependent to private organizations. That would also count for the transport production side, where we would really need, well, first of all, MaaS is dependent on the production of transport capacity. As I said in the beginning, MaaS does not create transport capacity, so we need all kinds of services available in the city, but we also need to have these services digitally accessible for MaaS providers to resell these services through their applications. So authorities will actually need to make sure that any transport service operating in their areas is connected to this public data platform and make its services and systems accessible through this infrastructure. So for public transport, we, for example, envision the use of single tickets, day tickets, and multi-day tickets, so kind of incidental travel tickets to be generally accessible. And for commercial users, for commercial services, we envision the standard minute tariff that would be generally open. And how can we ensure that service providers are willing to do so? Well, that's where the infrastructure comes at play, because we see the infrastructure, or better, the regulation of access to public infrastructure, as the single most effective regulatory tool that we actually have as authorities and cities. So we pretty much need to link the access to public space to the availability of services in this digital infrastructure. So it's a bit of a technical discussion. To conclude, what issues we're actually struggling with, and which we do not necessarily see addressed by the general debate at the moment, is are we actually traveling more sustainable with MaaS? We don't really have evidence. Then is there actually a market for competition at the service level? That would be our biggest question, because the model we propose would create competition at services and not competition based on, or business models based on data ownership. So is there actually a business there? Are stakeholders willing to participate in this ecosystem? And the last question, can we actually handle MaaS success? Because our transport systems are full. Any mean in our transport system is full. So the question would be, if we have large shifts from car to public transport and shared modes, are our cities actually able to handle that if MaaS proves successful in a very short while? And that would be my presentation. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you, Thomas. I think those questions, actually might lead quite nicely into what Krista's going to come and talk to us about. So, Krista, are you there? Can you hear us? I think we've still got Krista on mute. There we go. Krista, you're currently still on mute, if that's deliberate or not. Oh, there we go.
Now, right?
Yeah, perfect. We can hear you. Yeah, loud and clear.
Great, and hopefully you can see my screen as well on my presentation. So I think that I'm going to continue on the lines with Suzanne and Thomas. That greetings from Helsinki. I'm gonna up you one. We're expecting snow tonight. So basically what we'll be talking about is our first full live year as a mobility as a service provider. I'll still introduce myself. So I'm Krista from MaaS Global. I'm having a dual role at the moment. That's head of ecosystem and sustainability, as well as heading our go-to-market activities at the moment. And let me go forward. So basically, just to give you a quick glimpse of what MaaS Global and our WIM service is about, it's basically that we're the world's first MaaS operator, where we combine in our app all of your mobility needs. We basically have at the moment the pay-as-you-go model. But what we're particularly proud about and where we are leading the development at the moment is also offering monthly subscriptions. So currently we have two types of subscription models. We have what is called the so-called WIM Urban. That includes unlimited amount public transport and then unlimited amount city bikes, and then preferential rates for other modes such as taxis and car hires and car shares, etc. We also have an unlimited package, which by the name of it basically includes absolutely everything unlimited. We're currently live now in Helsinki, where we started about 18 months ago. And we're also live in West Midlands in the UK, as well as Antwerp in Belgium. But we will be expanding quite aggressively still this year. We will be live in 16 cities, including our first mega cities by the end of this year. And what we've also promised that there will be global roaming by the end of 2020. So, but I think that kind of to tie up what, for example, what Suzanne was talking about, that we really need to be looking at the bigger picture. What sort of problems are we trying to solve? And I think that certainly the way that we look at MaaS, it's actually taking those big policy problems, those rather universal transport policy problems that we've had for decades, that MaaS, we can actually have a beautiful marriage with also our company's interest. Because if you look at it, most of those problems actually derive from privately owned vehicles and single occupancy vehicles. Now, that's where most of the congestion, that's where most of the emissions are coming from. But if you look at it from expenditure side, that's also where most of the money is. So hence, what our company, MaaS Global, is really competing with, we're competing with private car ownership. And what we want to do is that in order to make MaaS more attractive, even better than owning your own car, you really have to be able to give people access in a very easy, affordable way to everything, so that we can cover all of your mobility needs. So where are we at the moment? How do we see actually the markets evolving? So basically, at the moment, the situation is this. It's almost like every single transport service provider or MaaS operator want to own their whole vertical. So they want to have their own little nice ecosystem. And I think that this also ties into what Suzanne and what Thomas had always been already been talking about. That does this actually provide users the choice that they need? One of the things that we can see, and this is particularly, I would say, that kind of the Silicon Valley mode, is that we have different companies or different operators deriving to have the monopoly. That really they want to be in control and be the one preferred app for everybody. Then again, what we're seeing currently quite a lot in the European markets, then again, is that the local PTAs and PTAs, so the public transport operators, that they would want to be on top of the whole MaaS ecosystem locally or regionally. Now, if we really want to be tapping into those policy goals that we have, what we are saying and what we fully believe in is that you have to have this open ecosystem. So indeed, to create the choice for the end users, because I fully agree with Thomas's note, for example, that we can't be tapping into absolutely everybody's needs. So there's no one size fits all. And this applies to the end users, but this also applies to the regional and, for example, the different cities. So what you really have to have is to have choice, and that will have to happen in an open ecosystem where there's actually competition between the different supply that you have on the ground, but also competition on the MaaS operator field. So how do we see that this happens? What are the principles that we at MaaS Global have? So basically, what we believe in is that we want to cooperate with everybody. So basically, we do not operate any physical services ourselves. This will keep us a neutral partner to all of our transport service providers, as well as it will also mean that we're not biased as such to any of the different services that are accessible via MaaS Global's app web. We also say no to exclusive deals. This is one of the tricky ones for some to understand, but we really fully believe that, you know, there has to be that choice. There has to be the choice again on the transport services level, but there has to be also choice for the MaaS operator level. So, for example, we've had different private companies wanting to sign exclusive deals for which we basically said no, but we've also had plenty of different cities approaching us and asking that, could you please be our preferred MaaS app? And to that, we always say that, yes, we'd love to come, but if you are providing those APIs and those tickets available to us, if you're doing that work anyways, why don't you open up them to everybody else as well? Because in the end, the users want to trust that there's choice for them. The users want to trust that if for some reason they wouldn't like one particular MaaS operator, that there's also another one that they can choose from. Going back in particularly to the sustainability goals that we've also set for ourselves. So we do not launch without public transport. The public transport together with the soft mode, so walking and cycling, will have to be the backbone of MaaS. And so I'm happy that Thomas was also talking a lot about data. So we always also share data, because indeed it's kind of embedded in our operational and in our business model. We don't take our users' data and monetize it. But what you use that data for on an aggregated and anonymized level is obviously that we share it with our different partners. Because as we don't produce any of the services ourselves, we're fully dependent on our partners. But as this is the way that our system has been set, it obviously makes sense for us. The more data we share with our partners, they can improve their services, which obviously improves also our overall service. So when we're talking about what sorts of partnerships we have with the different cities, as well as the different transport service providers, it's pretty simple, to be honest. One of the things that we have basic criteria for launching a city. So we need to have the basic supply on the ground. That will be public transport. We have short car replacement and long car replacement. But then there's obviously different city specifics. And I think that we have to, for example, take a city like the size of Antwerp, and then again a multi-million city, a mega city like Singapore. You have different must-have requirements for those cities that are very much local. But what is common for all of them is basically that they must be accessible through a mobile app. So our basic requirement is really an API that grants us access, not just to data, but to tickets, or it grants us access to a seat, for example. So there was Thomas was asking for data. So yet again, fully believe, and I think that I always like to highlight at this point, for example, so we've only been the first ones in the world, and we've also only had just our first full live year in one market. But so we want to share whatever with the findings we've had from that particular first year, and it's pretty good. So what we can see that from our users here in Helsinki from the first year, so in 2018, people really are the heavy users of public transport. And one of the things that make me tickle in particular is that they also use it in a multimodal fashion. So they use it together with taxis and they use it together with bikes. As well as if we're looking at the accessibility side of things, what we've also calculated, or actually a company called Ramble, to whom we gave our first year's data, is that there's huge potential. There's huge potential for MaaS to grow according to the along the public transport corridors, but there's also, once you increase the accessibility to different micro-mobility, also you increase the scope of MaaS addressing more and more people's needs. So, and you have to kind of remember the bigger picture. So if we want to have people moving away from their car ownership and moving away from the single occupancy vehicles, there still will be times you can't have the avid hardcore car driver swapping directly into fully walking and cycling, but you have to have that car option there as well. When in the cases when it's, for example, pissing down, or when, for example, you will have to be, you've just purchased a cabinet from IKEA. So for that particular reason, we're also happy that we have been increasing, for example, the usage of taxis here in Helsinki. But then quickly going back, like, how do you do that public-private partnership? I think that one of the things, obviously, it's still very, very blurry, and the disruption is happening now extremely quickly, and it can be confusing to many, and I don't think that anybody has any definite answers yet. But one of the things that the whole transport sector really should be emphasizing on is that it's the user's choice that really matters. It is really them who should be dictating what sort of services, and indeed that there should be choice for them to choose from. And so, whilst looking at those big challenges that we're facing, as well as the kind of the development of technology, and what the users are really expecting at the moment, is that we need to have this thing happening a lot faster, and we need to be making the future together. So, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Krista. Right, I'm going to introduce Chris ViaVan, who's going to talk a little bit more, sort of finishing this off, on the on-demand and connection between both public and private. Chris, are you there?
I'm here.
Awesome. We're sharing the screen now, so there you go.
Okay, great. So some of you may know a bit about Via and ViaVan. ViaVan is actually a joint venture between Via, a public transportation technology company in the US, and Mercedes-Benz Vans, a small car company that no one's ever heard of. I want to sort of quickly bring you through our vision, because I think it helps to understand the product that we are offering for cities and public transport companies. So we're focused really on two kinds of inefficiency. The first is this, it used to be that the two kinds of certainty in the world were death and taxes. I think now it's death and traffic. And at least in the United States, 85% of people commute by themselves, by car. 85% of people commute by car, 90% of them by themselves. Fundamentally, you have one person sitting in a car with 5 seats, and this drives us crazy from an intellectual point of view, and it obviously is is hugely inefficient at all levels of the way our cities are working. And by the way, cities are growing by 2/3 over the next 30 years. So this is a problem that is not going away. But there's another kind of inefficiency around solutions. And you know, this is I show this picture not to suggest that that public transport doesn't work, but that it doesn't work all of the time for everybody, and that it isn't the right solution for every problem, or at least the traditional types of public transport that we've had for the last 150 years, fixed route and fixed schedule. However, we know that people actually love public transport when it's really good. And this is a ranking of public transport systems in the United States by quality, increasing on the right, and then on the vertical axis, the percentage of people who actually commute using public transport versus their private car. And you see that as public transport gets better, people will adopt it. The challenge is how to make it really good. Now, in the U.S., this is a particular problem. In Europe, I think there's quite a number of cities that have truly excellent public transportation systems. But even there are areas that are growing rapidly that have not seen the investment that perhaps city centers have. And beyond the major cities, many of the cities that a lot of folks are living in have not seen anything like the level of public transport investment. And unfortunately, we know that to make transport really good requires incredible amounts of capital. I live in New York City. The 2nd Avenue subway was built, just finished last year. It cost something like $5 billion a mile, which is absolutely unconscionable. So what we have developed is technology that allows a bus to be as convenient and on demand as a private car or a taxi. So you can use your phone to hail a seat, essentially, in an on-demand bus, an on-demand shuttle. And what happens is our system will send you to a nearby virtual bus stop, which we calculate in real time among thousands of potential options, and will match you with other people who are also heading in your direction, and will direct the vehicle along a completely dynamic and flexible route. So whereas before we were living in a world of fixed routes and fixed schedules, where if the bus didn't go where you wanted to go, you maybe had to change 2 or 3 times. Now the bus goes where you want to go, minus a walk to this virtual bus stop, and then a walk from the virtual bus stop. And what this allows us to do is, especially in areas where it isn't efficient or possible to launch traditional fixed route public transit networks, to massively expand the use of public transport and ultimately reduce congestion. So what you see is sort of a legacy public transport. If you imagine a single fixed route line, it's as if you are drawing with a ballpoint pen. And then when you allow an on-demand system to function in an entire zone, then people can get picked up much closer to where they are, and get dropped off much closer to where they're going. So a dynamic routes and on-demand allows you to have a dense network of pickup and drop-off stops. So Via and ViaVan, we actually operate 2 complementary businesses. One is a consumer platform which is operating in the United States and Europe, where we have done 50 million rides since we launched our first service in 2013 in New York City. But increasingly, we're finding that cities, public transit authorities, mobility providers are very interested in utilizing our technology to launch their own on-demand services. And now we have a global partnerships business where we have launched a Via-powered service all over the world with transit agencies, with cities. And I wanted to give you a few small tastes of some of the work that we're doing. But maybe first, just to kind of highlight what happens when we launch a VIA-powered service in an area where it is really crying out for a re-engineering of the existing public transport. So the first thing that happens is we see a rapid adoption of this new public transport service, this new on-demand public transport service. And that's not so hard to understand because all of a sudden, instead of waiting 45 minutes or an hour for a bus, you can hail on your phone and watch as it comes closer to your virtual bus stop. It's taking you much closer to where you need to be. And because you're sharing the ride with multiple other people, it's very affordable. So we like to think of this as the midpoint in a way between a taxi and a traditional bus, and a real alternative as a result to private car usage. The second thing that we see is across a whole number of operational metrics from the point of view of the city or the public transport company, just a huge improvement. So much better utilization of the seats in the vehicles, lower headways and waiting times for customers, and also lower costs as a result. So I thought that I would talk for a few minutes about what we're doing in London with TfL. By the way, in London, we also operate quite a large consumer-facing service. So this is quite an interesting situation where we are working with TfL in the borough of Sutton, which is a part of London which is rapidly growing on the one hand. The number of startups doubled in Sutton between 2009 and today. But has very high dependency on private cars and relative to other parts of London, very low access to public transit. And so we won a competitive tender to launch London's first on-demand bus service, which will go live this spring. And here's a little overview of Sutton and why it's a good option for the service. So it's about 200,000 people with a very high percentage of inter-borough commuting, so intra-borough commuting, people who live and work in the same zone. On the other hand, it also has over 70% car ownership, so very high access to cars. And while the interior, the center of the borough is well connected by rail, a lot of the new employment centers are towards the fringes and are not. So you have these pressures as employment is growing. Currently, only way to really access those jobs is by private car. So what we're doing is we've partnered with Go-Ahead, which is one of TfL's major contractors for their bus services, to launch a one-year pilot, which is aiming to do a number of things, but fundamentally to maximize the convenience of using public transport and to make it much more broadly available to people who live or work or both within Sutton. It's going to be 7 days a week, fully accessible. So if you're in a wheelchair, every single one of the vehicles will be accessible. It's also cashless, but also accessible in the sense that if you don't have a phone, there will be a number to call. And so we're trying to make this as broadly accessible as possible, including to those folks who have Freedom Pass, who are Freedom Pass holders, and they will receive a free waiver. So. And this is going to use the same technology that Via uses and ViaVan uses in deploying our own consumer services. So the model here is really, it's truly a public-private partnership, both in the sense of risk sharing and in the sense of data sharing, and in the sense that what the goal of the pilot fundamentally is to understand to what extent this can be valuable for extending into other parts of London, and if so, how? And so I wanted to also mention a few other services that we are providing. One in Europe and in Berlin with BVG, so which is the Public Transport Authority in Berlin, where we are operating the world's largest public sector deployment of on-demand buses in the east of Berlin. Here, the goal too is to reduce reliance on private cars ultimately by extending BVG's existing public transport network to include an on-demand layer that is integrated fully into the public transport system. And here, the vehicles are ultimately going to be 100% electric and fully integrated into the trip planner app, as well as the fare structure. in Berlin. And then I also wanted to highlight, just very quickly, I know we're running out of time, a service that we're operating in West Sacramento, California, which is probably not on anybody's radar screens, except for the fact that it is one of the thousands of cities in the United States that are mid-size and lack access to really robust public transport networks, not so unlike Sutton in a way. Population of 50,000 people, and what we've done is launched a fully accessible on-demand transport solution that is accessible to the unbanked, that is seeing very large adoption of senior populations, that has very high customer service ratings. And interestingly, based on a recent survey that we did of a number of people using the service, quite a large percentage, we're seeing that well over 50% of riders have switched from using a private mode of transportation to a shared mode, basically move from their car to public transport, which I think is exactly the goal and shows that these services can be successful not only in increasing the convenience and affordability of transport within a city, but also positively impact the city's policy goals. So I'll come to the end there.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. We are running quite close to time, and we've actually had a heap of really, really thought-provoking questions come in, so thank you all. But if I've got everybody off mute, we had the first question actually, which was from Bill Peatman. Hello, Bill. Which was for any and all presenters, what is your opinion of agencies using Uber as a MaaS platform? Is it not letting the fox in the hen house? You need to unmute people to respond to that. Thomas, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the end, if in the kind of ecosystem as we're proposing it to the market, I mean, we're really trying to find a kind of authority perspective on this MaaS development and discuss that with all other market parties. So we're really at the beginning with this process. And what I see is if Uber is one of these apps at the transports at the mobility as a service at the service level, so the customer facing side of the ecosystem, then that's totally fine, because they have a system and they have a client base, but their Uber services, so the actual ride-hailing service, would need to be available for other MaaS providers as well, and they would need to get the access to integrate public transport and other services into their app as well. So they will have the interesting two-sided market perspective there. But I mean, if it's an open system and their services are available to others and they take services from others into their app, then it's totally fine. But what Krista rightly mentioned is that the sentiment in a lot of companies is rather to have a vertical ecosystem for themselves and not open it up to other services. And that is what we need to get rid of. And that is where we're proposing a sort of public data infrastructure. If that answers the question, I hope it does.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I've got one last question just to the group if we have time. A really good question from Sunila, which is, what is in it for transport operators when it comes to joining mobility as a service platforms? Is there a win-win scenario, or are we talking about a scenario with the operators at the bottom of the value chain? Does anyone want to have a stab at that?
Certainly start from I can start from my side. So I think that indeed there's a mobility as a service operator like ourselves who kind of combine absolutely everything. So we do get a very, very good bird's eye view of people's whole holistic mobility chain. So I think that that's one of those things that are particularly interesting and particularly crucial for PTAs and PTOs to get. And once again, at least with our operational model, when we don't operate any services ourselves, so for us it's built in in our operational logic, that we share that data. So in that sense, it's definitely a win-win scenario. And another thing also that we have, I think that the way our kind of business model has been built is that for us, the best choice from a business logic are the green choices. So if you look at that, where is the lowest production cost value here? So it's basically, it's walking, cycling, public transport. So for us, it also it makes all the sense to be pushing people to use those modes as much as possible. So that hence means that for us, it's built in the way that we work, that we also try and get as many people using public transport as possible. And if you look at it from the PTA and PTO perspective, so obviously that should be very, very beneficial for them.
Cool. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, just one quick thought, which is a slightly different tack. I think I agree with Krista, but I think there's a separate question that I think we try to address, which is, why should mobility operators get into some of these new businesses, right? Some of the why should they get into the on-demand business? And I think there the implicit understanding that at least I hear when I talk to public transport customers of ours is that there's a very strong sense that competition, whether it's from the Ubers and Lyfts and of the world, or just from the private car, it is going to slowly or more quickly erode their own position, right, within the mobility ecosystem, and that in order to continue to grow as population grows, and frankly, that's how it's supposed to work, by the way, they need to innovate. And that's not comfortable always, but I think it's really, really important. And so who you choose to innovate with, I think, is crucial.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Well, look, on that note, I'm going to say thank you to our speakers. That was really interesting for myself, and I hope for everyone else that was watching. So thank you very much. The webinar has been recorded, so we will send this round to you either tomorrow or early next week. And I just wanted to say, from my point of view, if you are not already joining us or involved with us in Amsterdam in June, reach out to me directly. I think you have my details. Talk to me how you can get involved or attend. You can see the event details on the holding slide here. We've got a really, really good group. We have similar style conversations. It's lots of granular conversations with the right people, which is what we're trying to do. So if you're not coming along, come join us. And in the meantime, I wish you a happy Thursday from a very sunny London. So have a great day, folks, and speak to you soon.